Hey, David Taub here. I hope all's going well, and I hope your guitar journey is going famously. I want to bring you a lesson on signal path and also on effects groupings. Remember, as far as signal path, that's the path that your sound, your signal takes as it leaves the guitar and then goes either through effects or maybe right into the front of your amp and then into the preamp, into the power amp section, or if you have an effects loop, that meandering path that it takes and the effects it goes through, anything you put between your guitar and that amp or in that effects loop, anything you put in between there is going to affect the sound, right? So we want to go over the different groups of effects, and we also want to go over a little bit about, effects order and signal path. And one thing to keep in mind is that there's really no rules, right? A lot of this depends on what sounds best to your ears. Now, there are some conventional wisdoms when it comes to, the order of effects and what effects to place before the others, and do you put certain effects in the effects loop versus putting them, before the amp. And we're going to talk about that conventional wisdom. But the bottom line is that you have to experiment. And if you want a free reference ebook to help you along your guitar journey, where I diagram out like 29 scales and I talk about all kinds of soloing strategies, it's packed with lessons and tons of fun stuff. You'll really like it. It's a great reference tool, and I'll send that as well as a video lesson for free on how to spice up your soloing. Simple things that you could really add. I'll send them both to you. Free video lesson, free ebook. Click on that link below from Next Level Guitar. So let's talk for a second about groupings of effects. The first group of effects is our gain staging or boost effects, right? And these effects consist of things like boost, whether it be a clean boost or a boost that's adding gain, overdrives, distortion pedal, fuzz pedals, right? Those are all adding gain, adding something to your tone. And those are all basically grouped under the gain staging effects pedals. Frequency effects. And these effects that fall into that category with things like wah pedals and envelope filters, EQ pedals, pitch shifting and harmony type effects. Those are all different types of frequency effects. Then you have your modulation effects, and some of the effects that are grouped under that heading would be things like where you're modulating, volume, like a tremolo pedal, a vibrato pedal, a chorus pedal, a flanger, phaser, phase shifters, right? These are all modulation effects. You have your time-based effects, and those are mainly your reverb pedals and your delays. And then there's kind of a bunch of pedals that fit under the other category, and these pedals could be like looping pedals or amp modeling pedals, amp emulating pedals, multi-effects pedals, noise gates and suppressors, things like that usually also fall under the other category. There are some conventional wisdoms that come with effects pedals or, rack effects. And basically, you have a few choices. Now, a lot of this depends on if you have an effects loop in your amp or not. If you don't have an effects loop, then clearly everything you put is going to run from your guitar right into all these effects and then into the front of the amp. We call that, pedals in front of the amp. If you have an effects loop, then you have a choice. What pedals do I put in the effects loop? What pedals do I put in front of the amp, right? And there are some conventional wisdoms about that too. I personally feel that some effects do sound better in the effects loops. They sound a little bit more natural than in front of the amps, but that's just me. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, if you have an effects loop, basically what that is most amplifiers, they have a preamp section and then a power amp section. Okay, so think of it like that. The preamp section is where your signal is going and it's getting, that wonderful overdrive or distortion, or it's getting the EQ, right? All that happens in that preamp section, and then it goes into the power amp section, and that's where the sound is amplified. What an effects loop is it's this loop that's in between those two. It falls in the middle. Okay, so and that has a send and a return, right, that you loop your pedals into. So your pedals are going into your signal chain after the preamp section. Then they'll hit the pedals because they're in that effects loop, that send and that return. Then they'll return back. They send out to the first pedal and out the last pedal through the return and then into your power amp section. And like I was mentioning, some effects, in my opinion, and many other opinions also sound a little bit more natural in the effects loop, like time-based effects, reverb and delays pedals, and rack effects. I always tend to put them in the effects loop. I think they sound a little bit more natural. Personally, I also like modulation effects in the effects loop also. But that's me. That one is kind of, a lot of people go back and forth. Some people really like the modulation effects in front of the amp, right? That's before the preamp section, right? Coming out of your guitar, hitting those pedals, and then going into the front of the amp. And some people like me like the modulation effects in the effects loop. Again, you want to try, if you have the effects loop, try both and see what sounds best to your ears. Other pedals I like in front of the amp. Me personally, I like my gain staging pedals, if I'm using them, distortions and overdrives, I like those in front of the amp. Personally, I really don't like the way they sound in the effects loop of an amplifier. Some people like it though. Again, you have to find what sounds best to you. If you have an effects loop, try them both. It definitely sounds different. And sometimes you can get these different sounds and you might want to use them both, right, at different times, depending on what you're going after. There are two different kinds of effects loop. There's a series effects loop, which is basically just that send and return that you see in the back of the amplifier. And there's also a parallel effects loop. And what this is, you can usually tell parallel effects loop because they'll have a mix knob. And what that is, it'll be the loop in between that preamp and that power amp, right? Where you can run the effects. We'll have one that goes straight through, and the other one it'll be in parallel, there'll be two, and the other one will go through your effects. And that one you can control through that mix or blend knob, how much signal versus how much affected sound that you want. So that's a parallel loop. And hey, if you get a second, please subscribe to the channel. You know, subscribing to the channel, that really helps us to keep bringing the content. Please leave a comment below. Let us know what you'd like to see in coming lessons. If you like the video, click the like button, give it a thumbs up, share it, and we so appreciate your support. Generally, a lot of people agree on putting your wah pedal or your tuner in the front, like coming out of your guitar right into your wah pedal as the first pedal, or your tuner as the first pedal. Now, some amplifiers, like some of the rigs that I use, they have out of the amp, they have separate outputs that just go right to the tuner, which is nice. This way it's totally disconnected from the rest of your signal, which is nice to have. Some amps have that separate hookup for tuners, some don't. If you don't, put the tuner generally in the front, going into the front amp, but early on in the signal chain. And then so basically, let's say if you don't have an effects loop, so everything is going to be running in front of the amp. A good basic setup generally is you put your wah pedal, and then you put your gain staging pedals next, your distortions and overdrives, fuzz pedals. Then you put your frequency pedals next, then your modulation pedals, then your time-based effects like your reverbs and delays, and then out of those into your amp. That's a very basic kind of setup, that kind of conventional wisdom that most people, you can start with that and see how you like those sounds. Now, if you're getting a lot of noise, if you're running a high gain amplifier, right, and you have a lot of noise in your signal chain and you want to use a noise gate or a noise suppressor, a lot of times those will be place those toward the back of the chain, right, one of the last effects, but put it before your delays and reverbs, before your time-based effects, because if you put it after, gates after that, and you have a delayed signal, then hitting that gate, the gate might be shut and it's going to shut off. That you might not hear that delayed trail because the gate will close, right? So put the delay pedal, put the suppressor or the gate before your time-based effects if you're going to use one. And then if you have an effects loop, and keep in mind that all the effects loops are different, right? I've played through some amps and the effects loops are built really well and they're very transparent. And I've played through other amps and the effects loops don't sound as good. They color the pedals and they're just not as transparent sounding. Maybe they're just not made as well. But keep in mind, effects loops aren't all created equal. Some are better than others. So again, you have to experiment. And a good conventional wisdom for setting your pedals up if you have an effects loop is try your time-based effects and your modulation effects in the effects loop and everything else in front of the amp. A couple other quick tips when you're setting up your pedals: try to keep your cables as short as possible. Also, if you're using patch cables to go from effect to effect, use the same type of cable, same manufacturer, same cables throughout your signal chain. I think it really makes a difference. Another quick tip is about how are you powering up your effects. Obviously, if you're using a rack effect, you're going to be plugging that straight into an outlet, right? But if you're using pedal effects, you're going to power them either by 9-volt batteries, or I suggest using a power supply and making sure it's an isolated you're getting each effect, you're getting isolated power to each effect. You're not daisy chaining them together with power. You're going to get so much noise and interference that way. Forget about connecting each of like the little power outlets together with a daisy chain and then going into a power supply. No. Get an isolated power supply that's providing separate power for each effect. Like Voodoo Labs, I'll show you some pictures, makes a real good one. That's the one I like. Walrus Audio makes a good one. There's plenty of them on the market, but you definitely want isolated power to each effect. Remember to experiment, get creative. There are no rules. Have fun with it. You could do a lot of interesting things. You could run a delay pedal, right, and get some cool delay sounds, and run that into another delay pedal, and you get some really cool sounds. There's no rules. Have fun, experiment, stay creative, and we'll see you in the next lesson.